There are more outbreaks of healthcare-associated infections related to flexible endoscopes than with any other medical device. These complex medical devices are difficult to clean, and their instructions for use are detailed, lengthy, and must be followed every time. The goal of this program is to educate and remind reprocessing professionals of the essential steps necessary to make them safe for patient use.
At first glance, to someone who's not a professional reprocessing person, all flexible endoscopes may just look like long black tubes. Some are longer than the other. That is probably the biggest misconception to people who work with flexible endoscopes. Each endoscope has a unique configuration.
Some scopes have multiple channels that can be used to insert instruments or to inject water or air to assist the physician in doing the procedures. Other scopes, like the scopes that are used to inspect your nose, are tiny, and those don't have channels at all. So they're much simpler. Now, when you're going to reprocess a scope, it's absolutely essential that you know what the instructions for use are for that particular scope, because what's needed to clean a very tiny, fragile ureteroscope is very different than what's needed to clean a scope used for colonoscopy or an upper GI procedure.
Let's begin with the first of our 10 essential steps for reprocessing flexible endoscopes: pre-cleaning at point of use. Pre-cleaning should begin immediately following the completion of the procedure. Blood and soil that dries can facilitate microbial growth and increase the risk of biofilm formation, which can double every 20 to 30 minutes. And once biofilm grows, it is difficult or impossible to remove. Attach the water and channel connectors per endoscope IFUs. Prepare a container with a solution that is compatible with the device. If it's a videoscope, attach the protective fluid-resistant cap. To remove all gross soil, wipe the tube with a wet, disposable sponge soaked in solution. Dispose of the sponge afterwards. Place the distal end of the endoscope into the solution and suction the solution through the biopsy suction channel. Alternate solution and air several times. Detach the scope from the light source and suction pump, and visually inspect the endoscope for damage. Coil the endoscope into a large circular configuration without kinks and carefully place into a closed container for transport. If using reusable accessories, they should be pre-cleaned if indicated in the IFU and placed in a separate container. Label containers as biohazard. Note the time and ensure a speedy transport to decontamination. If there is a wait, follow your facility's delayed reprocessing protocol as well as the delayed reprocessing instructions in the endoscope IFU. Endoscopes that require leak testing should be tested with no exceptions prior to manual cleaning.
You can consider leak testing that first check to see if that endoscope is going to get the patient where they need to go, and that's down a road where there's no chance of an infection from that scope.
You can't see inside the scope, so you need another method of determining whether there are little leaks or holes in the scope that could allow blood or fecal matter or secretions to get inside the inner workings of the scope. They could damage it, or they could come out into another patient during a subsequent procedure.
We also want to be sure the scope is going to work. The last thing we need is for a physician to be in the middle of a procedure and find out that they have a scope that's malfunctioning.
Leak testing can be wet or dry, manual or mechanical. Select the method appropriate for the specific endoscope and follow the leak tester IFU. If conducting a wet leak test, fill the sink or basin with the proper level of clean water. You'll want an area large enough to accommodate a minimally coiled scope. Visually inspect the scope for tears, holes, or obvious signs of wear and damage. Attach the leak tester to the venting connection, ensuring the cap is fully on and locked. Pressurize the endoscope before submerging and maintain pressure for the time specified in the IFU. Fully submerge the scope in clean water without detergent and fill internal channels with water. Flex the distal portion of the scope in all directions while observing for bubbles. Observe the control head of the scope while depressing the freeze and release buttons. If O-rings and control knobs are damaged, air bubbles may escape when knobs are turned. Pay close attention to seams and joints. Check the insertion tube and distal bending section, as well as universal cord for bubbles. If a hole is present in the internal channel, air bubbles will exit via the distal tip. The presence of air bubbles or failure to maintain pressure during testing is a positive indicator of a leak.
Doing a leak test takes some time because you really have to watch for those bubbles or watch to see if the pressure drops in each different configuration as you turn those knobs. So you have to take a few minutes to do it and do that carefully every time or you won't know if there is a leak.
I think the other thing with leak testing is making sure that it's done in a solution that is completely bubble-free. And sometimes we use the same sink for leak testing that we did for cleaning right before that, and there may be some detergent or something in the sink that may cause some bubbles that may throw things off as far as our visualization.
If a leak is detected, the leak testing device should remain attached to the endoscope and under pressure until it is removed from the water. Tag the scope for repair and follow manufacturer guidelines for proper cleaning and high-level disinfection before returning it to the repair facility. If the endoscope passed the leak test, remove it from the water and drain. Turn off the tester, which releases pressure from inside the scope, and verify deflation of bending rubber at the distal end of the scope. Disconnect the leak tester from the endoscope. Continuous air pressure prevents water from entering internal portions of the scope, causing damage. The goal of the cleaning process is the complete removal of soil such as blood, fats, proteins, lubricants, and biofilm.
Flexible endoscopes are probably the most difficult cleaning process that we're ever going to perform because we are trying to clean something that we cannot see.
Endoscopes are known to be heavily covered with natural secretions, fecal matter, blood, and tissue. Cleaning is important because you need to physically remove those substances in order for the high-level disinfection or sterilization to work.
Begin the manual cleaning process by disassembling the endoscope and immersing in fresh enzymatic cleaning detergent per solution IFUs for temperature, concentration, and water quality. Keep the endoscope below water at all times. The device must make direct contact with the detergent on all surfaces to be effective and for the required contact time. Wash the exterior of the insertion tube with a single-use soft cloth or sponge and avoid splashing. If applicable, open all ports during the process and repeatedly actuate valves to facilitate access to all surfaces. To clean the interior, first choose the appropriate brush for the specific device or opening. Brush valve cylinders, openings, forceps elevator housings, and channels. Brush multiple times using varied brush strokes to help ensure that the brush friction reaches all areas within the lumen. This is important because brushing times have varied widely, and some parts are missed altogether or not done for the proper length of time. Rinse the brush between times as you pass through channels to remove debris. If you meet resistance, stop immediately and soften by soaking. Next, facilitate flushing by attaching the channel adapter to the ports. If indicated by the manufacturer, attach tubes required for irrigation to suction, biopsy, air and water channels, elevator, and auxiliary channels. Thoroughly rinse and flush channels with water until all cleaning solution is visibly removed. Repeat the cleaning, brushing, and rinsing steps until all visible debris is eliminated. Purge channels with air using a syringe or instrument air per IFUs to evacuate residual rinse water. Dry the exterior with a lint-free cloth to remove any residual detergents or water droplets, which can dilute sterilants or high-level disinfection chemicals. Throw away disposable brushes. Replace reusable brushes that are worn, frayed, bent, or damaged. And clean and sterilize or high-level disinfect reusable brushes according to IFUs. Finally, clean counters and sinks after every manual endoscope cleaning to prevent cross-contamination.
Sometimes I'll talk to people that are cleaning endoscopes and they are so busy. And they say, if I have an AER that has a cleaning cycle, can't I skip the manual cleaning? Why do I need to do that? Because I've got a machine over here who's doing it for me. And I like to use an analogy. Most of us have a dishwasher nowadays, or we're familiar with them. And we know that some things like a water glass can be just put into the dishwasher. It's probably going to come out clean. But we know when we have something that's got a little more soil on it or a little more difficult to clean, that we're going to do a little pre-cleaning before we place that in the dishwasher. Because we know that if we don't, it's probably going to have to be recleaned when it comes out. Well, there's a huge difference between a little bit of soil that's left on a baking dish and soil from a previous patient that can get into the next patient. And so we need to not only clean, but we need to clean again. And we need to do the best job we possibly can using every tool available to us.
Once cleaning is complete, visually inspect the scope to verify the effectiveness of cleaning and ensure the endoscope is free of defects. This may require lighted magnification or additional methods to assist, such as a borescope, which is a device that allows you to see inside of the channel. If you detect any debris, start at the beginning of the cleaning process, complete all cleaning steps, then re-inspect. Given the complexity and importance of the cleaning process, verification is an essential quality control measure to ensure effective, high-level disinfection or sterilization.
Because you can't see inside the scope, you don't know whether the actions you've taken to clean the scope actually removed all of the soil. You need some other method that can tell you if you were successful in removing the blood, bodily secretions, fecal material, or tissue that might remain in an endoscope after it's been used for a procedure. Now, there are a number of different kinds of tests that can be used for cleaning verification, and these can pick up very small residues of protein, hemoglobin, or adenosine triphosphate, which is called ATP in the field. ATP is just a substance that's secreted by any living cells, and so it's a marker that would tell you if there still is soil there. When you do that cleaning verification test, if it shows there's still soil, you could re-clean the endoscope prior to subjecting it to the high-level disinfection or sterilization process. Each cleaning verification test kit has its own benchmarks and thresholds that tell you whether or not there's still residual soil. So you have to read the instructions for use for each of those kits to make sure that you know exactly how to use it and how to interpret the findings.
To perform an ATP cleaning verification test, swab the distal end surface or flush sterile water down channels and test the swabs or water for residue. AAMI ST91 recommends testing the suction and biopsy channel as a minimum. Tests should be performed during every reprocessing cycle or at least daily for every endoscope used. Results will come within a few seconds. If the scope passes, document and prepare the scope for further processing. If results show the endoscope is still dirty, document the results, then re-clean it right away and repeat the cleaning verification test to ensure the contamination has been removed. If the endoscope fails the test a second time, then it may be damaged. Document the result and tag the endoscope for repair. Once cleaning is verified, perform sterilization or high-level disinfection according to the IFUs of the endoscope, chemical or sterilant manufacturer, and equipment manufacturer.
Current guidelines permit the use of high-level disinfection techniques to reprocess flexible endoscopes. But I believe we should be thinking about moving towards sterilization for all flexible endoscopes. That's because we know from multiple studies and investigations of outbreaks that high-level disinfection doesn't give us the margin of error we need to be sure the scopes are free of pathogens before the next patient use.
Ethylene oxide, or ETO sterilization, is the most common sterilization process for flexible endoscopes, as it's the most compatible with delicate, heat, and moisture-sensitive medical devices. When packaging for sterilization, Be aware that most endoscopes require the attachment of an ETO vent cap provided by the endoscope manufacturer to prevent damage from the vacuum in the sterilization chamber. According to Spaulding's theory, when sterilization is not possible, use high-level disinfection.
In my view, we should be trying to move away from the use of manual processes for high-level disinfection. One of the reasons for that is that it's very, very difficult to do manual high-level disinfection correctly. You have to maintain the temperature of the high-level disinfectant in that basin for the entire time, or the disinfectant won't work. And you have to make sure that you're exposing the scope to that disinfectant for the appropriate amount of time. Now, if you expose it for too short of a time, a quick dunk in that bath of high-level disinfectant, that won't work. But in many institutions, if they're doing manual high-level disinfection, they're leaving that scope or that instrument in the bath of high-level disinfectant for a lengthy period of time because they're busy when the timer rings. When that happens, the scope can become damaged and any residual debris could be hardened under the scope even more, and you could get fluid infiltration by extended soak times. But we also have to be thinking about the safety of the personnel here, because to do manual high-level disinfection, somehow you have to perfuse that very strong chemical down the channel. You're going to do that using a syringe, and when you're doing that, you want to make sure that you don't get splashed with that high-level disinfectant or get it in your eye, as very serious injury could happen if that were to occur. In addition, with the manual HLD process, you have the possibility of exposure to the fumes because you're working directly with very strong chemicals. In my view, it's much safer to use an automated reprocessing system that can take those steps away from the staff, make sure that they're done properly for the right time at the right temperature without employee exposure to those chemicals.
AERs are automated with regard to immersion, filling channels with solution, timing the exposure period, and rinsing with water to remove the solution residue. Once the scope has been placed into the reprocessor and properly connected per endoscope manufacturer IFUs, input data regarding the patient and load into the AER if that feature is available. Start the reprocessor and allow it to complete all cycles and phases.
Sometimes when a flexible scope is placed in an AER, there can be some issues. For example, the machine may have an error in the readout. Sometimes it's because the connections aren't on tightly. Sometimes it's another problem with the machine and the machine is malfunctioning. Whenever that happens, whenever we have an interruption in a cycle, stop what you're doing, find out what the problem is, and then correct that before you move on.
Next, dry the scope.
We have known for years in sterile processing that moisture causes bacterial growth, that it actually facilitates the growth of bacteria. And we're taught, keep our decontaminants as dry as you can, make sure that items are dry when they come out of our wash or disinfectors. We're all about drying, but we need to move that thought process over to flexible endoscopes.
The drying methods that are recommended in the current guidelines and the instructions for use simply aren't effective enough. We've done a number of studies that have shown that following the guidelines and IFUs for drying scopes simply don't result in scopes that are completely free of residual moisture. Current guidelines that are put out by AORN recommend the use of a drying cabinet. These sorts of cabinets circulate filtered medical-grade air through all of the channels to make sure that they stay dry during their entire period of storage. If you don't have access to a drying cabinet that circulates air through the channels, then you need to do extra things to make sure that the scope is dry before you put it into storage. Taking the scope out of the AER and hanging it up to drip dry no longer is considered an acceptable method of getting that scope dry. So you'll need to use medical grade forced air to dry that scope before it's hung up for storage. Now, one other question that comes up about drying is the use of alcohol. While the guidelines and some IFUs recommend putting alcohol through the channels because they believe it aids in drying, our studies and research by others have shown that it doesn't actually assist in drying to the point that the scope ends up dry. There's new evidence from several published studies that show alcohol can help make the protein or other residue still in the scope, if it wasn't all removed, adhere to the scope. So the use of alcohol as a drying aid might actually be a step backward.
More damage occurs to flexible endoscopes during transport and storage than at any other time. Place the scope in a clean, disinfected solid container with a lid, coiling the tubing loosely and supporting the distal tip. Transport in a manner that preserves the disinfection status. Be sure documentation is sent with the scope that shows all the steps in reprocessing were performed correctly and by whom. Ideally, store the scope in cabinets that continuously circulate HEPA-filtered air around scopes and through channels to remove any residual moisture. At a minimum, store according to the endoscope IFU in a manner that prevents recontamination, protects from damage, and promotes drying. The storage cabinet should allow the scope to hang vertically with the distal end hanging freely, without coiling or touching the bottom of the cabinet. Horizontal drying and storage cabinets are also available. Make sure the angulation lock is in the open position, and if there are reusable, removable parts such as valves and caps, keep them in a small container with the scope. Follow your facility's protocols for the maximum time scopes can remain in storage. Scopes that are stored for longer must be reprocessed before use. Documentation is imperative to show adherence to all of these essential steps. However, it may vary according to facility protocols. Although we have covered a few recommended documentation requirements throughout this program, a tool will accompany this module that will help your facility comply with documentation recommendations by AAMI ST91 every time you reprocess flexible endoscopes. There is no doubt that reprocessing flexible endoscopes is a true challenge. Regardless of the difficulties, the time has come for us to personally commit to following best practices to the letter, because every single step is essential, and the consequences for non-adherence have never had more serious implications.